Welcome to the BrettJohnson.biz podcast, where we discuss business on purpose, radically fresh leadership, capital that transforms society, and marketplace stories that embolden difference makers. Welcome to the Repurposing Business podcast, and I'm here with my good friend John Enelamah from Nigeria originally, but now all over the place. And John, you're living in the US nowadays, but we met back in 2008 when I first came to Lagos, and you were and still are an integral part of Apostles in the Marketplace, and our good friend Pastor Ben connected us, and since then we've had the opportunity to spend time together.
That's correct, Brett. Yes,
Yeah,
that's true.
yeah.
And we've done quite a few things together.
Done quite a few things together. John came out to California in 2012. It might have been our very first repurposing business executive intensive, and it was out in Saratoga. And yeah, we had an amazing time. It was good to have John with us. Yeah, and I've got to know some of John's family. And if you've listened to these podcasts already, you would have heard the conversation with Oke, who is John's brother. And John, you've got quite a collection of siblings, all very accomplished.
We thank God.
We think your parents deserve a medal, you know. Yeah.
Grateful to God for His faithfulness.
Yeah, yeah. So John stirred up my thinking in a WhatsApp last year sometime. And John has written many books, by the way, more than 10 books, John, last time I was counting. I'm not sure how many you have now, but it's good to have somebody else who writes lots of books. I don't know if your wife also complains, because Lynn says to me, Brett, why don't you sell the books you have before you write another book? I don't know if Ngozi says Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds like my wife.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I think the way it works is that if you're an inspired author, you're always getting inspirations, ideas. It's best to document them. You know, it's like the Obama story. You know, Obama had at least 2 books before he became president, and they all became bestsellers when he was in office. Something would trigger them someday.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So, John, before we get into our specific conversation, which I'm delighted to explore with you, just tell us a bit more of your history and your background. Just tell us a bit of your story and so on.
Sure. So, my father, who went with the Lord in 1990, was a pioneer Methodist minister, Methodist clergyman. He was trained by British missionaries, and the work he did most of his adult life was evangelism, missions work under the auspices of the Methodist Church, Nigeria. So I was born in a manse. As you may know, Methodist ministers live in what they call manses, founded by John Wesley and George Whitefield and so on and so forth. And they use the word circuit because John Wesley was known as a circuit riding preacher. So they use circuits in their vocabulary. So my father was the superintendent minister in Uzuakoli, where I mostly grew up, but I grew up in 2 manses, first in Enugu and then Uzuakoli, all of them in the east, what is called today southeastern part of Nigeria, but there was eastern Nigeria. So I had my background in Methodism, went to good schools, missionary schools. My primary school was called practicing school because it was for training teachers. They used to use us as guinea pigs to practice, which was good. And then I went to Government College Umuahia for a year and transferred to one of the Unity schools in Nigeria, Federal Government College Okigwe, and then eventually studied quantity surveying in University of Ife, now Obafemi Awolowo University. While I was in college, I had encounters with the gospel preached to me, and I ended up accepting Jesus as my personal Lord and Savior. I might have been in my 2nd or 3rd year. And then once that happened, I started sensing what I might call the movements of the Spirit, as if God was calling me. But the only thing is that I couldn't discern His voice. I don't know how He calls. I don't know what He's calling for, but I knew there was something going on within me. To cut a long story short, at some point, I realized that God was actually, asking me to work for him, work with him, which is the call of every Christian, really. And I embarked on that journey that took me, from Nigeria to California for a season, back to Nigeria, and then the founding of apostles in the marketplace and the planting of churches and the traveling ministry as it is today. So that's been my experience that you can hardly ever keep up with God if you try to understand what He said.
Fantastic, fantastic. Well, John, thanks for that overview. One of the things that we had started having a conversation about, and I'm just looking back, was back probably middle of 2025,
Yes,
and you popped me a note and you said, "Hey, Brett, I've been thinking about something, and one of the things I've been thinking about is this notion of how we view the gospel, and that the conversation we started having was around what in the book I'm calling, our threefold mandate or the three strands of the gospel. And this is key to the positioning of the book on investing with Africa. As you see, some people are going to struggle with it theologically, John, because when we think so much about the gospel, go into all the world, make disciples of all nations, we think people, 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 and then
sure.
with a little bit extra, if you're a Western church, you think, if we send 2% to the people in Nigeria or somewhere over there, or the crazy people go to the ends of the earth, just the radical ones. But, there's a whole lot of stuff around that, but we're missing a whole piece of the gospel. And so I'd love to unpack that with you and just talk it through and how you've seen it and just unpack this for people so that they can get their minds around these three strands or these three parts of our mandate. Does that sound like a good conversation?
It sounds like a good conversation, Brett. Yes, yes,
Okay, great.
yes,
Yeah. So backing up a little bit, we talked about the Great Commission, but prior to that, we actually have the first commission, which you and I have spoken about, which is to work. Adam and Eve were put on the
sure.
earth to work with God, co-labor with Him, Adam and Eve to co-labor with each other. And in the evangelical world, it seems like we forget about the call to work and we think, instead of work, I'll just go and do some ministry, I'll do something more spiritual. But our first calling was to work. How have you seen that playing out? Because apostles in the marketplace is very much, and your own life's work is very much about getting to the full integration of things.
Yes, yes. No, that's quite interesting. I think that the challenge, I'll come to that in a moment, but one of the challenges we face is the challenge of language, what I call etymology. Because most of us read the Bible in English, and the writers of the Bible didn't speak English. So that's already a challenge. So, and once I understood, I realized, my God, what about if there's a gap between what they're saying and what we are reading? Not
Yeah,
intentional, but just gap in language, And I think when we get into the nitty-gritty, we should think about that a little bit. But going back to the concept of work, I also think because of the movements within the body of Christ and Christianity in the last maybe uh, 300, 500 years, and in particular in Nigeria in the last maybe 50 something years, the gospel of miracles, prosperity, there is a de-emphasis on work. And if you go back a bit in history to the Protestant Reformation, you know that one of their great conclusions was that work is worship, that you're
yeah,
worshiping God when you're working. They talked a lot about the dignity of labor. And
yeah,
they changed the world. Their concept of work was very, very sound doctrinally, and they took their work seriously. So they didn't face the real challenge of people thinking that if I did nothing and claimed I was worshiping God all the time and really didn't have any income, they didn't have that challenge because they dignified labor.
yeah,
But I know theologically, there are people that think that, oh, that if you have favor, I meet this all the time, that if you have favor, if you have grace, that you don't need to work. It's almost as if there is a competition between favor, grace, and work. And people have
yeah,
asked me, and because I rarely speak about favor, maybe because of my own background, I came from a background of not just theologians, but these were academics. I used to be a member of Deeper Life, and Deeper Life found that Pastor Kumi had a first-class degree in mathematics.
Yeah.
And then I'm a friend of the Redeemed Mission, and Pastor Deboye also had a first-class degree in mathematics. So these are intellectuals, right, who brought the rigor
Yeah.
of schoolwork to their ministry, and they
Yeah.
excelled. They went to the right, they went right to the top of whatever they were doing, right? And Pastor
Yeah.
Kumi said that divine intervention is no alternative to industry. That's one of his quotes.
Yeah.
And that's pretty interesting because when I was a student, there was a myth, and I know it's a myth, like if you're really a first class brain, why do you work so hard? Why don't you just but but the truth is that I never found any first class student that was not diligent and hardworking.
Yeah.
But they
Yeah.
had a myth, right? So
Yeah.
if you come back to that concept, the way to look at it is that I do not think that favor is an alternative to industry or hard work. When people
Yeah.
say to me, "Oh, by the grace of God," I say, "Well, I said, look, I mean, one of the best theologians of the New Testament is Paul the Apostle. I say, look at what he said in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. By the grace of God, I am what I am. By the grace of God, I labored more abundantly than them all." So Paul used grace to labor. He didn't use grace to
Mm.
play. And he said, I do not want to frustrate the grace of God. So my concept of life is that grace is actually for labor, for hard work, for diligence, for research, the rigor of research. I don't think somebody says that sometimes people say 1,000 hours of work is equal to 1 moment of grace. I don't know. I don't know. I don't believe in that. I don't teach that personally because
Yeah.
everybody, the people that you associate me with, Pastor Ben Akabeze has a first class degree. Aya Doboye has a first class degree. Shegolu Jobi has a first class degree. Okay, Enelamah finished from Harvard with high distinction. These are my closest pals in AMP, right?
Yeah.
So I'm surrounded by people that were not intelligent by theory. They were intelligent on paper. And most of these people they were either went through at Anderson, like most of them, or Anderson Consulting. So they had a background in Pastor Ben worked for one of the big accounting firms in Nigeria. And I'm really close to these folks. And I can see the
He
result.
worked for the right one, by the way. He worked for Price
By the right way,
Waterhouse back in the day.
Price Waterhouse, which you worked for. I don't know. So for me, and Brett, I don't want to sound funny, because people sometimes say you're sounding elitist. I'm really focused on the principle of hard work, of
Yeah.
diligence, of putting effort, of the rigor
Yeah.
of research. I mean, when somebody reads your books, for example, they can tell that you come from a background of research. You don't just write. I mean, you're an inspired author, no doubt. But when you combine inspiration with research, it's explosive. It's very
Yeah.
powerful. It's a very
Yeah.
powerful combo.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's really, really good, John. That's really, really good. I love Colossians 2, verse 5, where Paul says, I delight to see how orderly you are and how firm your faith is,
Yes.
because, it's not order or faith. It's not diligence or faith. It's not diligence or favor, as you say. It's, those two things go hand in hand. And I love it, even for those who come out of a Pentecostal or charismatic persuasion, even if you look at 1 Corinthians 12, there's a combination of order and the gifts
Sure.
of the Spirit working hand in hand. It's not one or the other. And we tend to sometimes throw our Presbyterian brain out of a charismatic window, and so I love that. Great, good. So, John, going beyond our first commission around work being worship, work being good, work being an evidence of God's goodness. And, these are the basic things. These are like brushing and flossing. These are the basic things that we do. It's like, um, the basic things of life. Work is good. God worked before the fall. Work is worship. Work is a way that we demonstrate the glory of God. Our work can demonstrate the glory of God. We're called to work. Most of us are called to work in the marketplace. I've worked in some places in Africa and other parts of the world where they say, well, you can't have a job in the marketplace and be a minister of the gospel. But what I love about Nigeria is almost everybody I know, there are a few rare exceptions. They are bivocational or often trivocational. They don't have that split. I was once up speaking in North Africa, and the poor pastors over there who get paid a pittance, 100 or 200 pounds a year, and they got 2 or 3 kids. And if they can't live off the pittance of money, then the church says, they don't have the faith to be a pastor. And they won't let them go and get a job. They can't drive an Uber or have vending machines or run a store, because they say, no, you've got to be doing your spiritual thing. So that's not the problem in Nigeria. I love the integration of work and faith in Nigeria.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. And as you know, it's interesting. By the way, Nigeria has its history, and I've heard a number of stories, very interesting stories. The first one I would like to tell is the Apapa family of the RCCG mission, which is headquartered at City of David, where our friend Pastor Kayode Peter is now the head of the family. But the first
Mm.
head of that family was Pastor Dr. Tony Rappo, and then handed over to
Yeah.
Pastor Esco, whom you also know, and then from Pastor Esco to Pastor ID, and then now Pastor Kayode. What's interesting is that Apapa family was a major move inside the RCCG commission, where God swept into the kingdom young people we might call yuppies, who were professionals, full-blown professionals at the distance, and they did not stop being professionals as they practiced their faith. So it changed the face of Christianity. So these were the
Yeah.
boys in Nigerian palace. So these are the happening people in society. And
Yeah.
suddenly going from clubbing to preaching the word. But these were chartered accountants, these were professionals. And of course,
Doctors.
many of them
Yeah.
went on to become leaders in the marketplace and so on and so forth. Some have gone into government, high-ranking officials. I think he made it a bit easier because they were already professionals. Then they became Christians, and thank God the teaching they received was mature enough that it didn't make them abandon their professionalism, even though they
Yeah.
pursued God in the
Yeah.
marketplace. So that's one dimension. And the other dimension I heard as a story is that also within the RCCG commission, they said that Pastor Deboye, because himself was a very hardworking person, that as the church was expanding, he felt that he got more out of business people being called to pastor than people that were, in quote, full-time pastors that didn't have the rigor of labor, of research,
Mm.
and all that. Now, I don't want to sound funny, but this was a story I was told that when it came for time, he felt, look, I would rather work with this person that's already producing results in the marketplace and ask him to bring the same rigor to the work of ministry, in quote. If you define ministry as the limited definition of the local church, which you and I know,
Yeah.
that's not ministry, but that's the limited
Yeah.
definition. And he
Sure.
had more results. He had more results. So coming from that, I think it's about a mindset. It's a
Yeah.
mindset in the sense that I have a friend who is a pastor he's Nigerian, but he's lived in the Netherlands for so many years. So he's now naturalized. And he was a pastor with a very, very successful ministry, in quote, lots of people being mentored. And one day he was traveling to Florida. He said he was going to go to pilot school. He was getting involved with businesses. So I asked him, why are you doing so many things? Aren't you satisfied being a pastor of a thriving local church? I mean, you have thousands of members. Why do you want to learn to fly a plane? Why are you getting into all these business ventures? He said to me, I have so many gifts in me. I don't want any of them to be dormant. I want to
Yeah.
activate all of them. Wow, that was a perspective I'd never
Yeah.
thought about
Yeah.
it. The pastor can say today
Yeah.
I'm fly planes because he feels there's pilot in me. Why should
Yeah.
that pilot suffer because I'm preaching 3 times a week? So it's a mindset, it's a perspective to say
Yeah.
that if God has made all these investments in our life, if you
Yeah.
have the capacity to be a medical doctor, and
Yeah.
then go into business or a chartered accountant and then start repurposing businesses, would you let any of those things suffer? Why don't you use your experience of
Yeah.
being a professional chartered accountant that is,
Yeah.
putting the books together, thinking about businesses? Why don't you apply that to the kingdom and see
Yeah.
what can come out of that? So that's how I
Yeah.
see it today. But it's a mindset.
That is a mindset. Yeah. When you tell the story about what happened in the Redeemed Christian Church of God when you had the influx of young people, I remember Ben told me the story about the Lavender Boys. You know what the Lavender Boys are, right? You remember
Mm-mm.
that? Oh, yeah. So when they started having their ministers' meetings, and the
Okay.
guys from the rural villages
Okay.
They thought you shouldn't use deodorant. And when the chartered accountants and the doctors and the business professionals started to go to those meetings, then the guys from the rural area called them the lavender boys.
Makes sense. Understood.
Yeah,
Wow.
but amazing. Yeah, the key point over there is I've often said it's way easier to teach a CEO or a business director or a bank manager to pastor their people than it is to teach somebody who's only had training as a church leader
Mhm.
to understand what's going in the marketplace. So I think it was super smart as to what the general overseer did there in promoting that, not stopping that. I think it's amazing. I think that's great.
Sure.
So John, let's move on to our conversation that we've been having about the three strands of the gospel, right? So
Sure.
Matthew 28, ethnos. Talk to us about that. What's the essence of ethnos?
Yes. So from the word ethnos, we get the word ethnic. And the primary meaning of the Greek word ethnos is people groups.
Yeah,
And what's good about people groups is that when you define people groups, it simply means a group of people with common language, common culture, common boundary. It doesn't necessarily mean a nation, which is a country.
yeah,
It doesn't mean countries, because there are many
yeah,
people groups in one country. So traditionally, the church thought about ethnos as going to countries. But you're passing many people groups on your way to one country. When you go from Nigeria to South Africa, you're passing thousands of people groups, if not
yeah,
more.
yeah,
Because in
yeah,
Nigeria alone, there are over maybe 250 people groups in Nigeria alone, if not more.
yeah,
And I think what makes it significant is that now that's where I come in. I now decide to look at the word etymology, which is the history of words, how they've been used over time. You can even reduce to the science of words. And you say, I started asking myself, what language did Jesus speak?
yeah,
And they said Jesus must have been multilingual because the lingua franca of his day was Greek, but not even the classical Greek, but Koine Greek, which is the language everyday use of traders, which he was a carpenter. So he would have
yeah,
known a bit of Koine Greek. And then because he was Jewish, he must have spoken Hebrew, which was the language
yeah,
of the synagogue. And
yeah,
then Aramaic, which was the language of dispersion, is what they brought back from all the countries they came to. So Jesus would have spoken, maybe even a bit of Latin. So when you think about it,
and he grew up, John, in Egypt, right, until he was 12 years old. So
until he was 12 years. So,
yeah,
you
so
can imagine that
maybe a
makes
fourth language.
maybe a fourth language. And so when you think about it, you say to yourself, okay, so when he was speaking, I know that the New Testament is mostly written in Koine Greek, and so the word there is ethnos. I like to ask myself, what did it mean to the original hearers? The people that heard it
Yeah,
were sure they were not confused. So it's good to go back in time and say, what did it mean to the people groups? Also, rich people groups, white people groups. Well, the way to think about it today is that if you think about people groups, you're thinking about medical doctors, businessmen, nurses, educators. You're thinking about politicians. You're thinking about Igbos, Yoruba nation. You're thinking about, the Hausa nation, Fulani. And then you go back to other nations, there are people groups in those nations. And when it says rich people groups, why would he say that? So my thought is that the best way to reach a medical doctor is a medical doctor. They
yeah,
have so much in common. They just have a normal conversation. In fact, I tell people that if a president who is kingdom minded, who is a disciple of Christ, wants to reach another president, all he needs to do is schedule a state visit.
mhm,
And he goes. Now, in the course of a state visit, usually if you come to visit a president, even if you're a prophet, a notable prophet, you're always timed. When the time is up, somebody will come and say, Sir, you need to go. This man has other things to do, and you have to go. But in a state visit, a visiting president can even tell the sitting president, by the way, I think you need to excuse everybody, just me and you. Let's talk. Let's just have some conversation. And then you can now start
yeah,
saying, what about your wife? I know
yeah,
we're big guys. We're always performing on TV, but how is your marriage?
yeah,
But only a president can talk to that president like that. So the
yeah,
easiest way to reach a president, and that's the way I see application of people groups.
yeah,
Run. I know you like to teach outside of the box, like run outside of your lane, for example. But in this case, I would like to say, if you run on your lane, you can be more effective for the kingdom. I
Yeah.
think about a medical doctor. It's same thing with medical doctor. Like now that my wife is an educator, my wife has a background in pharmacy and then did a master's program and did another one, and then eventually did a PhD and teaches in a university. So around her are professors.
Mm.
These are people she could never reach before. I mean, if you're a
Yeah.
student, you want to talk to your professor, you have to book an appointment. But when you're a professor, you're always with professors talking about this or that. It's so much easier for
Yeah.
them to see your life. And the last point I want to make before I withdraw, before I kind of pause, I have a friend who is my classmate from secondary school. We finished school about 41 years ago from high school. My friend studied architecture both in Nigeria and in the US. But he knew that his divine design was in the area of more of advertising, that kind of stuff. He said he just understood it. So he went into the public space, worked for an advertising firm, became a CEO, eventually was hired by the Apple company in 2018, where he spent about 6 years, I think, till 2024, so thereabout. But he said to me that when he worked in the Apple company, he was one of the highest ranking people of African descent in the Apple company. And that, I mean, he had interaction with everybody from the CEO to very senior vice presidents and so on and so forth. And he's a Christian. He didn't wear it on his sleeves, but he was a Christian, and he
Mm.
always had high performing teams. He said to me that they used to ask him, "Why do your team members do so well?" He said, "Because I empower them." He said,
Mm.
"How?" He said, "Well, when I read First Corinthians chapter 13, every place I see love, I remove it and put leader. The leader is patient. The leader is kind. The leader suffers long. The leader is not puffed up." So that's how I lead my teams. I let them do the job, get the credit. If they fail, I accept responsibility. But when they're doing well, but he said something else that because of that high performance of his team members and teams, it gets the attention of very senior people in this wherever
Yeah.
he worked, and they be asking what makes the difference. And sometimes they say this is not professional work, it's not career. Tell us more about yourself. Talk, we have problems. So, but the lesson I took away from that, he wouldn't be sitting on the board with the pharmacy of the Apple company if he was a mediocre Christian living in his village and never went to school. He's able to
Right.
interact with these high level people because he's doing well in his own career and he's right in his people group.
Right. Excellent. Fantastic. So I love that. I remember years ago, 2008, I was doing a research project with Cisco Systems, and they were looking at this question of innovation. And working with them, we defined a people group, which was the global business consumer. So these people were identified themselves not with a nation or a village or a city, but they were global citizens. In terms of their culture, they were business. You know, they spoke business 2.0. It doesn't matter if they were in Lagos or in Los Angeles, they
Sure,
spoke the same language. They used the same tools. They used
sure,
iPhones and stuff like that, and they behaved like consumers. That's where they were. So this people group of global business consumers. I mean, it's a couple of billion of them, and
sure.
uh, and that's the people group that we're after in the marketplace, that we're part of,
Uh,
and that we reach. And so I love the thinking around ethnos that is not just the traditional international boundaries that are sitting on a map, as you say.
sure,
And I know in the investing with Africa, I don't know how many people groups there are in Africa. I know there's well over 2,000 languages, um, and a lot. So, but I like the notion of saying, okay, let's look at the people in healthcare or the people in education or the people in government, business,
mhm.
etc., and how to be part of that. So I love that. Okay, let's talk about Acts 1, verse 8. You'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth. What are we talking about there? Are we talking about ethnos or something else?
We're talking about eschatos to the ends of the earth, and this is country specific or country reliant or country based or about countries. So
Yeah,
he says, my witnesses, he said, starting from Jerusalem, which is it's territorial, Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, to the ends of the earth. So this is the traditional missionary in church.
yeah,
Where are you going for? You're going on missions. Where has God called you? Oh, Jerusalem. Oh, Judea. Oh, I'm going to Japan. I'm going to
yeah.
Korea, and so on and so forth. And this is the part the church has always understood. So China Inland Mission, Hudson Taylor, or maybe the gentleman who came to Africa, even
Yeah,
the explorers that
yeah,
found the New
yeah,
World. They were all
Yeah,
missionaries.
David Livingston and
David
others like that.
Livingstone,
Yeah,
yes,
yeah,
they were all missionaries, and they were going to
yeah,
territories. It was
yeah.
very easy to say, "Oh, okay, wow, I thought I was in India, but I found myself in America," and so we call them American Indians, and so on and so forth. Yes, so that's Acts 1:8.
Yeah, so that's great. So far we've got two. So people understand people groups. Well,
A
they
little bit,
understand nations roughly,
sure,
understand people groups, but need to broaden the definition so that they
sure,
don't think, oh yeah, well, I'm just called to the Swedish, or with the World Cup going on now, I don't think, people pick their favorite nation. I think it's Norway this week. But
yes,
yeah, that's right.
sure,
And then the eschatos, the ends of the earth, and we get words like eschatology and things like that.
sure.
And so we understand that one. And historically, as an accountant, what I would do is look at the budget of a church and say,
Mhm.
I was working with a church once, and a venture capitalist in the Bay Area said, I'm going to fund somebody who's a skate pastor. So he's going to be going after skateboarders, and they put up skateboarding ramps in the church parking lot and so on. I'll fund him for a year, and then the church can decide whether to keep funding this guy.
Okay,
Well, what was interesting was after a year, the church said, no, they're not going to fund him anymore. And I went to them and I said, if you look at Jerusalem, these are people who are already in the church. They're in the pews,
sure,
90% of your money, maybe more, goes to people who are already in Jerusalem. Judea is people who are sort of pro-church and pre-Christ. And then you've got
sure.
Samaria. These are people who are not even on the radar, really. They're not so keen on church.
Hmm.
And then you've got the ends of the earth. I said, it's great. You look after Jerusalem and you send money to the ends of the earth, or you do mission trips to the ends of the earth. You go down to Mexico, or you go to Rwanda or something like that. But you do nothing with Samaria. This is the only guy in the church, the skate pastor, who's bringing the kids off the street, telling them they can't swear and they can't smoke on the premises. And he's the only guy who's reaching those people. You need to allocate some money to that. So
Sure.
we've typically allocated money to Jerusalem and to the
Connect
ends of the earth.
the ends.
Yeah. But
Very
there's a
well.
third one we spoke about, John, and want to unpack that with you. So talking about Mark 16:15, right? He said to them, go into all the world and proclaim the gospel to every creature. Is that ethnos? Is that eschatos? What's that?
That's very interesting passage. So he said, go into all the world and proclaim the gospel to every creature. So the church, again, in this passage, has focused on the word proclaim, which means preach, herald, and over the centuries been emphasized. But little or no emphasis has been placed on the word world. Go into all the world. So the word world in the Greek, again, is cosmos. And it's very easy to think about cosmos as worldliness. But it's deeper than that. Because when you look at it, cosmos talks about systems, it talks about society, all the world. Why that passage is significant is because when you look at it, Jesus said, preach the gospel to all the world. If you do not preach the gospel to all the world, what are you most likely doing? You're preaching the gospel to human beings, creatures, which is fine. But unfortunately, when the church or the ecclesia, the body of Christ, is preaching the gospel to people, there's first of all the danger of over preaching the gospel to human beings and focusing on the ecclesia itself, which you can come to later on. But the other challenge is that while you are busy preaching the gospel to human beings and not transforming systems, the systems will come and transform you eventually.
Yeah,
It's going to come and transform, because if you do not go to Washington, D.C., you don't go to Johannesburg, you don't go to Lagos and Abuja, and you're just preaching the gospel inside the, whatever you call it, whether it's auditoria, open spaces, the choices they make at the seat of government, which is just one part, politics, can overturn everything. They can just simply say, man can marry man. And then you say, oh, no, I'm a man of God. I cannot, I'm a baker, I'm a Christian baker. I can't supply your cake. They close your business. You lose
yeah,
your license. Then you are preaching the gospel and you don't preach the gospel to arts and entertainment. So Hollywood is led by itself. Well, over a generation, they make movies without shouting about it. After a while, the wrong values enter the church, change the church. It will change our dressing, the way you look at marriage. They've changed it. Just so marriage is just people are having an affair all the time. It's okay. You can marry 5 times. You don't need to. This thing is not so difficult. Why do you have to be
Yeah.
struggling to stay married? We can have friends. You can wear mini skirts. It doesn't matter. Why do you have to cover your naked? But this is culture because we're not preaching to
Yeah.
culture. So
Yeah.
it's a big issue because and you remember historically that Bill Bright Bill Bright was
Campus Crusade. Yeah.
Campus Crusades originally.
Yeah.
And then I know they've tried to play with the word
Yeah.
crusade so it doesn't sound militant, but that's what he was. That was who he was.
Yeah.
And then Lauren Conahun was Youth with a Mission. And they
Yeah.
had a meeting in the early 70s. And Lauren Conahun said that when they walked into the meeting, that Bill Bright said, "Oh, God just showed me something about how to penetrate society." And he said, wait, God actually showed me something. He brought out his own paper. And when they compared notes, it was really similar. In fact,
Yeah.
Hudson Taylor, a generation
Yeah.
before it could transform India, had to have these encounters with God. Of course, even Kuiper from Netherlands, from Europe himself, it was the same process that he was going through. So that's why I said it's important to think about etymology, words. What do they mean? When Jesus said, preach the gospel in all the world, it was not a careless statement. It was pregnant with meaning. What Jesus was really saying, if you break it down today, is do not forget to preach the gospel to the systems of this world, to society, the different aspects. Today we use the word planks, mountains, spheres. I love the word spheres. And the way I've done spheres are because there are many models. I know you have your 10 sphere model that you've used for many, many years now. Um, I mean, the model I use is almost like Ukrainian. It was taught to me by Adelaja, and I love it because I've tried to adapt it. So what I do, I use the ABCDEF model. So I say A is arts, sports and entertainment, and B is business, and I call it business and entrepreneurship. Then C is church, and then D, I now say digital media, just to make it media.
Mhm.
Then I use
Yeah.
E as education. Then I use F as family.
Yeah.
Um, and so the government is there somewhere. I skip G. E, F,
Yeah.
G. G is government, right?
Yeah.
But whatever, these are models. The important thing is not to leave any part of society. And the real challenge there, before I pause again, is that if Christians do not preach the gospel to all the world will come and preach the gospel to them and finish them.
Yeah. That's very, very good. Yeah. So I've I had a guy who read a draft of the Investing with Africa book. A friend of mine. He's a smart guy, has a PhD, and he's based in Africa. And he said, Brett, some people are going to struggle with these three different things. So I have a whole appendix in the book, as you know,
Sure,
that just
sure,
unpacks that. Because, and I encourage people listening to this, you go and you take a Strong's Concordance, and when the New Testament says, or when Jesus says the world, look up and say, is it ethnos? Is it eschatos? Because very often it's cosmos. So
sure,
when Jesus says, do not love the world, if the world hates you, the ruler of this cosmos is identified as Satan and so on.
sure.
And the ornament, it's how things are ordered and structured. I mean, today in some business terms, the supply chain that
Mhm.
goes from the growers all the way to the grocery store, the whole pipeline of how goods and services get produced, the healthcare system that goes all the way through from the medical doctor, the insurance company, everything in between.
Sure,
And when the scripture says God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself, it's not ethnos, it's not eschatos, cosmos as we know. And so I really
excellent.
think, we really need to look at it and think about it. And this is really, really important because when I look at investing with Africa and investing in the kingdom of God, kingdom economics, most of the money goes towards ethnos and eschatos.
Sure.
And people avoid when you say to somebody, we really need to think through how we're doing business or how we do agriculture or the agricultural supply chain in Nigeria, for example, or why are we importing fuel when we already have so much crude oil and so forth. And then people say, that's secular stuff. Why do you want to spend money there? And
Sure.
and yet these are the systems that God is speaking about. And
Oh,
so yeah, so I think that's I'm glad
excellent.
that you highlight that, because I think it's a challenge. And I mean, your brother, as we talked about last time, I mean, he's deals in hundreds of millions and billions in investing and so forth. And I think the risk of investing with that in Africa increases if you don't address Cosmos,
True.
because
Sure.
because you can even say, oh, I love this founder of this company, and they did a unicorn company before, or they're a great person, or they preach the gospel, or you know, but you don't deal with the system around them. You don't deal with having a business incubator, having an ecosystem, having a judicial system that works well, or courts that work well, or banks that are reliable. If you don't address these things, then the risk goes through the roof. And I think one of the reasons why people think investing in Africa is risky is because they don't want to invest in Cosmos. They just want to invest in people in the ends of the earth, you know.
Yeah. Very well said. Very well said. And I think that for people who struggle or might struggle or may struggle with understanding some of these very important concepts, it's good to look again at the New Testament, for example. One
Yeah,
of the words I was studying, it's just the word ecclesia, for example. And from my little research, I found out that when Jesus used that word, I will build my ecclesia, those who heard him understood it, and they knew it in one word: congregation, assembly,
yeah, yeah,
some group of people who are legislating. But
yeah,
over time, it was changed to church, which is not a
yeah,
translation of ecclesia, and church means building. So
yeah,
when people say, I'm going to church, that's I'm going to a building. Whether Jesus meant I'm building a people. And I found out historically there was a big debate about how the word will be translated, even in 1611 when King James gave the commission to do the King James version. What happened was that if the word ecclesia was translated as congregation, the power will be with the people. If it was translated as
yes.
building, the power will be with the king. So it tells me that we need some help.
Mm. Mm.
Yeah,
Very, very interesting, John. There's a yeah, that play on words, and people, even when people talk about the separation of church
church
and
and state.
government for a
Sure,
government, you know, back in the day in the agrarian economy, the church sat on the property of the landowner. So
sure.
when people said, "Ah, you've got to separate that," it wasn't to remove faith from the workplace. It was to
No,
give the church the independence to be a prophetic voice, a speaker of truth, etc., and
sure.
not beholden to. And interestingly enough, in the US, there's been a paper that's been put out as a draft paper by the US government saying this whole thing of separation of church and state has gone too far. And it's not to say that we need a state church, as you
Sure,
technically have in the UK. You know, the King Charles
sure.
is supposed to be the head of the church and so on. But it's to say, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Sure,
You need a healthy regard for religious practices, religious freedom, etc., and not
sure.
using language to create a separation that wasn't intended to be there. So
Yes.
yeah, so and we certainly did that with the notion of church. So that's a really, really good point as well. Yeah, yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, very good. So John, I'm excited about just dialing up the conversation on these three strands of the gospel. You know, I mean, ethnos still very, very important, but people groups are more than nations. It's more
Sure.
uh, than
Countries.
tribes, of which there's
Yes.
many. It's
Sure.
also, the back in the day when people talked about people groups, probably I suppose about 40 years ago, that concept was introduced. And part of the definition was it's the largest group of people through which the gospel can travel without having to go over a significant cultural hurdle or a other
Sure.
barrier. And so, yeah, I like your point about the medical community. I mean,
Yes.
it's like people group, or the people
Educators
in
as well.
education and so on. Yeah,
Yes.
love it. So that's great. And that's a good alignment with spheres. Whether you have 4 spheres or 14 spheres doesn't really matter, but some
Sure.
understanding of the nature of that. That's great.
Yes.
And I still think that the ends of the earth thing is really, really important, because I like your point about, and I've said this before in some of my books, that Jesus, the gospel was multinational from the get-go. You know, people say, oh, Jesus, it was just for the Jews. Jesus came for the Jews. But at the outset, we see when Jesus has his ministry, there are people from across the Jordan, Jordanians.
Yes.
There were people from Syria, people from Rome. There were the Romans. There were the Greeks. In his own background, there was the Egyptians and so on. I mean, the gospel has been multinational. You know, God's business is there before the MNCs, the multinational corporations, the
Sure.
kingdom is an inclusive, multinational, multi-ethnic, and then of course dealing with no slave, no free, no Jew, nor Greek, etc. It's such an all-encompassing thing, and it's also the systems of healthcare, government, media, entertainment, and so forth. And I do think that Jesus has been shortchanged because we focus just on ethnos and eschatos, and we haven't focused on cosmos.
That's true. I mean, if you think about it, even in that regard, I mean, the Romans were in charge. So you're dealing with Roman language, which is Latin, even at
Mhm.
that time. So it was the gospel was always international. And when Jesus was crucified on the cross, they wrote is King of the Jews, or in 4 languages. It was written
Yeah,
through Greek, Latin, and I think Aramaic or so.
yeah, yeah,
So I think we need to, the way I look at it is that we will not be able to have the impact that Jesus always wanted us to have in the world with our faith unless we look at this holistically, the way we're looking at it.
yeah,
It
yeah,
won't have
yeah,
that desired impact, because if you take
yeah,
one without the other, take two without the other, you're going to have issues. The one you leave unattended to will become the problem you face, which is what has
yeah,
happened.
yeah,
If you take the gospel, make it country related, dominant, and you're passing many mission fields on your way to that country,
yeah,
you
yeah.
know. And then
Very
if
good.
you're investing and you're not thinking holistically, you'll be thinking that we're going to have the desired impact, and you're forgetting the important areas of society. You have to
Yeah,
invest in all of them. A
yeah,
classic example is that in Nigeria, for example, the Okada riders in Lagos are a people group. If you doubt it, just hit one of them. They'll surround you. You'll be
yeah,
hearing what they're saying, but you can't decipher what they're really saying. But what they're really saying
yeah.
is going to kill you today. Today you're dying today. They are a group by themselves. So the
Yeah,
truck
that's very interesting. Yeah. So for those who haven't been to Nigeria, the Okadas are the motorbike taxis,
motorbike,
and
yeah.
yeah. And back when I first went there, and Fashola was the governor, and I
Mhm.
thought to myself, he understands more about discipling a city than the pastors do, because they were the lawless people. They went up the wrong way, up the one way. They didn't
Sure,
wear helmets. They weren't licensed, and
sure.
and I think he got them to get licensed first,
He
and
did.
then he told them you got to wear a helmet. Then he
That's
said your
correct.
passenger has to wear a helmet. And I remember the lady sitting at the back with a cheap construction helmet held 6 inches above their hair.
That's correct.
But
Just to pretend they were wearing a helmet.
yeah.
Yes.
And then the one-way police, and just, that people group, he was actually discipling that people group, which is quite something. Yeah. John, the other thing that we have to change is our metrics, don't we? Because
Mm.
traditionally, if you're going to put in patient capital, you're an impact investor, or you're a donor, and you say, we want to do something for the people in, Korea or Africa, wherever it might be,
Mhm.
our metrics have typically focused around ethnos
That's
and
correct.
and eschatos. So we might say, oh yeah, we put a well in 3 villages or 5 villages or 20 villages or whatever, or we had so many people saved, but we don't really pay enough attention, excuse me, to the
Cosmos. Of
metrics
cosmos.
around cosmos.
Sure.
And so I'd be interested, if if we said, okay, what are the healthy indicators that the cosmos, the gospel has been preached in its entirety to the cosmos? Yeah, there's an
Yeah.
interesting thing. Yeah,
No, that's an interesting. I think the way you would measure that would be the impact of the gospel on policy direction
yeah,
in a society, in a given society, the impact of the gospel on innovation. Because when you tackle the cosmos, there'll be more innovative ideas in society. Because those are the
I love that.
systems that run society. As you see more innovation. I mean, an example, Brett, is America. If you look at colonial America, you have to ask the question, how did the US become the dominant economy in the whole world? Because it
Yeah,
happened yesterday behind the British and the Romans and so on and so forth. And I know Alexis de Tocqueville, in his book, on democracy, came to the US in, I believe it was about the 18th century, and he said, "I came in search of her greatness."
yeah,
And he said, "I went everywhere, went to the commerce, priories, everywhere." He said, "Until I came to the churches of America." And I
yeah,
found that they were aflame with fire, with revival fire. And he said, America is great because America is good. If America ever ceases to be good, America will cease to be great. The way I look at it is that when you look at the US, colonial America, the Ivy League schools, which are mostly in the eastern part of the coast, the East Coast, from Harvard to Princeton to Duke,
yeah,
um, you know that they were all founded by Christian organizations. Harvard was
yeah,
founded by
yeah,
Puritans and so on and so
yeah,
forth. So,
yeah, yeah.
and the first graduates of these schools, by the way, Harvard is the oldest corporation in America because it's 1636. America is 1776,
Hmm.
140 years before the Republic, Harvard existed. Now, when you think about it, the first graduates were not businessmen per se. They were clergy, but they went to every aspect of society.
Right.
And so they knew that what will preserve a society are values that affect every aspect of society. You can't
Yeah.
limit it to the church. You're going to have a lot
Mm,
of problems. So these were
mm,
just people who were transforming values, and they were teaching that what makes the difference is values. And
mm.
so but how did America rise to the top? I think that's part of the answer. It became a nation of innovation because the gospel penetrated the society. They became very
Right.
innovative, testing the
Yeah,
boundaries.
yeah,
JK said, go to the moon. Within a few years, they were at the moon. These were
yeah,
very innovative. That's
yeah,
how I look at it. I mean, somebody has written the book. I'm sure you probably know Landa Cope that wrote a book, The Old
yeah.
Testament Template, and said, I traveled as
Yes.
a YWAM missionary all across Africa. And I was asking God, how can Africa be discipled, Christianized the way it is? And it's still the poorest continent. And he said, this is what happens when you preach salvation only and not the kingdom, which is what we're
Yeah,
saying, cosmos.
yeah.
You're not
Quite
preaching
correct.
gospel to cosmos. You're preaching it
Yeah,
to human beings and living cosmos. So people are getting saved, but they're still poor.
yeah,
They're living in
yeah,
poverty. They're not applying the gospel to all aspects of life. Then
yeah,
we're not discipling the cosmos.
yeah, yeah. For some people who might debate with you about the US, I remember when I was at University of Cape Town, I was doing
Mhm.
an economics class, 1975. So that's quite a few years ago. And and the professor, who was a Jewish guy, he was not a Christian. He
Sure,
said he was talking about Chile, the country of Chile down in
sure.
South America. And
Mhm.
he said there was an elite class and there were peasants in Chile
Okay,
until the Pentecostal revival came in 1906 as an overflow of what happened in Southern California. The Azusa
sure,
Street revival
sure. Powerful.
spread.
Mhm.
And out of that Pentecostal revival, a middle class grew in Chile
Emerged. Mhm.
and transformed the economy. I mean, the nation is different today because of that. And your point about
Mhm.
um, the innovation that
Mhm.
comes with the gospel when it gets into every part of society and we don't try to put it in a box. So I love
Sure.
that.
That's
Great.
powerful. Yes.
Yeah.
And what did he attribute? So I know that, yes, Azusa Street came to Chile, and there was the elite, there was the lower class, no middle class, but the gospel came to Chile and produced a middle class that transformed the
Yeah,
country.
yeah, exactly. Because, it's interesting. I've often asked myself the question, well, you've got a line in the sand between Mexico and the US, for example. The
Mhm.
geography, between Texas and Mexico, or between some of the border states, Arizona, California. Why is the economy good on one side and not so great on the other? And then I go
Sure,
back to the worldview question.
sure,
And Mexico was predominantly Catholic, and some
sure,
subsets of the US were, Louisiana, places like that.
sure.
And then you look at others, which is primarily coming out of the Protestant work ethic, and also the notion if you can determine where you're going to spend eternity, then you can decide if you're going to be a baker or butcher, a candlestick maker,
Sure.
whereas in Mexico all of the land used to be owned by the state,
Mhm.
so the church and the state owns the land, and you don't have this empowerment of people. And so the concept of the gospel touching every aspect of society, creating well-being, creating innovation, and so on. So yeah,
Yes,
I will say, John, though, I am excited about the innovation coming out of Africa, because what's different, I find, is the opportunities. Because there are problems still in Africa. There are problems with supply chain. There's a problems with, cold storage, or problems with this or with that, or with infrastructure, transportation. Those are opportunities for faith-based entrepreneurs. Those are opportunities. And you're solving real problems, not like in the US, like, how do you get your groceries today instead of tomorrow, delivered by FedEx or by somebody else? How do I get the best table at a restaurant, or how to get my dry cleaning quicker?
yes.
In Africa, you've got not first world problems, you've got real problems to solve, and
Real
that can
problem.
lead to innovation.
That's correct.
And I love that. Lynn and I remember us being at, I think it was the Four Points Hotel in Victoria Island, looking out the window, and there was a little community living behind a metal fence where they hadn't done a building yet. There was a well, there was everything. And Lynn and I said, man, you need to be entrepreneurial just to survive in Lagos,
That's
and
correct.
and uh, and I love the fact that there's an opportunity to solve real problems and come up with problems that can really make a difference, come up with solutions that'll really make it a difference. So there's an opportunity to collaborate with God innovatively in these untouched systems of the world where the
Sure.
gospel still has to come. Yeah, so that's great. John, thank you. Any closing thoughts from your side as we wrap up?
Well, I would say thank you very much, Brett. It's been a pleasure speaking to you. I'm sure this is going to be a continued conversation.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
it's evolving. Thank
yeah,
you for the great book, and I look forward to getting it and so on and so forth. Yes, I'm working
yeah.
on one. I call it the directions of the Great Commission, trying to find a way to, yeah, the three directions of the Great Commission.
Mm.
Yeah,
Oh, fantastic. Good.
sure.
Good. That sounds wonderful. Great.
Yes,
John, thank you so much. Thank you for
thank
your
you.
collaboration over the years. Thanks for all you're doing, and the bridge between the US, or North America, and Africa, of course, and everything that you and your family have been involved in. It's been a delight to partner with you. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
God bless you. Bye for now.
Bless you too. Thank you so much.